We have a correction. We talked on the drive-thru about well, how did the question come up? The question was Arn Anderson had commented on the biggest payoff that he ever got in Crockett Promotions, which led to a conversation we talked about of the biggest payoff I got in Crockett and who and et cetera, and some big payoffs. We part of the conversation we mentioned that the huge six-figure payoffs didn't come along in wrestling until the pay-per-view era, because I mean, well, I guess if it was run like one of these boxing fucking deals and Mayweather gets most of the gate, but otherwise guys in wrestling, you couldn't make six figures in one night before pay-per-view, but that there were some big payoffs. But Arn had mentioned, well, what was the question kind of phrased like?
I think the question was someone had heard a recent interview with Arn where he talked about the biggest payoff he ever had. I think the way it was written, it said it during his whole career, but specifically, certainly Jim Crockett Promotions was $12,500, and he was upset because he had been promised $25,000.
And I've got clarification on that from somebody who emailed who had heard the interview with Arn. He was talking about the Bash 88. We overlooked that one. Maybe we mentioned it. I don't know. But the Bash 88 was the only full pay-per-view that Crockett actually ran. As we've mentioned, the full clearance, I should say. The previous year, Starrcade, 87, and then the Bunkhouse Stampede, 88 in January, had not gotten most of the cable companies to clear it because Vince had strong-armed them into saying, if you carry their show, I'm not going to give you WrestleMania. And most of the cable companies went with the guy with the proven track record. But the 88 Bash is when Turner had stepped in and talks were starting about them buying the company, but Turner and Turner Home Entertainment had stepped in because they had clout with the cable companies. And as you'll also remember, Brian, because you are such a student of history, the cable companies ended up not being happy about this because it was costing them money, that the two wrestling companies were fucking with each other's big shows, because when Vince fucked with Starrcade and the Bunkhouse Stampede, then that's when Turner came back with the Clash of Champions live free on TBS against WrestleMania. So Turner was able, with their influence, was able to help get Crockett a full clearance pay-per-view for the Great American Bash 88 in July, and that was the only pay-per-view that he actually ran while he still owned the company that had full clearance. And so therein lies the tale of, and I'm sure at the time also, as we talked about, the Midnight Express and I had renegotiated our contracts earlier that year. Tully and Arn were still in the talks when Crockett found out that indeed not only was he not going to be able to give all these guys raises because of all this TV revenue money it was supposed to come in, advertising revenue money, and the network that they'd put together, but also he was in the hole. So I bet you that he probably was trying to make up for the Horsemen getting stiffed on a new contract. Because, I mean, we were still getting paid the same thing. Me and the Midnight made $5,000 for the Bash 88. I went back in my book and looked it up. We were still getting paid the same thing, but we had a contract that promised us a balloon payment at the end of the year if we hadn't reached this fucking sum, which is $225,000 a year apiece. So Crockett was probably trying to keep Tully and Arn happy by saying, oh, yeah, we'll give you whatever. Maybe he said 25. I have more reason to doubt Jimmy Crockett than I do Arn Anderson. And then he got 12.5. That's probably where they were grumbling. So I do believe Arn on the, and I didn't even think about the Bash pay-per-view that summer. Tully and Arn were in a tag title match with Sting and Luger, I believe, that year. But so it was a feature match, but in any way, I can believe the way that this comes together. No, wasn't it?
It was Luger Flair.
Luger and Flair.
Was it Sting and Dusty?
No, it was Sting and Nikita.
No, Sting and Dusty, wasn't? Oh, was it Nikita?
Well, it was Sting and somebody for the tag title. And then it was Luger and Flair on top.
Yeah, maybe it was Barry and Dusty, now that I'm thinking about it.
But anyway, nevertheless, he was trying to keep the Horsemen happy. So I can believe he got 12.5, and I can probably believe that he was promised 25. But then it was like, well, because then at that point, Crockett knew that he was going to sell pretty soon, or was probably going to be selling, and was just trying to keep guys holding on. But I did get an update on something else, because in that same talk that we had about, I said, there were still sizable payoffs. And I mean, you can go back in history. Guys like Strangler Lewis and Jim Londos actually had more of a boxing deal. And though they got big parts of the gates in the 20s and 30s, it was more like pro boxing, where the fighters got, and they didn't even advertise the rest of a card or have to pay a percentage of the gate or whatever. It was like, we're going to have the world championship match, and these guys are going to get most of the money. So there were payoffs, and plus we've seen some of the amounts that promoters would give guys either to buy a double cross or to buy the title or their rights to their guy getting the title or whatever in those days. And we also know that there were some pretty good payoffs going on in the early 50s with network TV and et cetera, where the guys were, the guys hot off Chicago television were making six figures per year. But in the modern era, we mentioned that, I said, well, I bet you Flair probably got maybe 20 or 25 grand for the Texas Stadium match with Kerry, right? And we bandied that figure around, just surmising. Well, I heard from another little bird, and this little bird wears a sequined robe and had a little strut to it, and was twittering, woo, woo. And that little bird got $12,000 fucking dollars for Texas Stadium, not 20 grand, and was highly perturbed about it. He says, I believe the exact words were, $400 and fucking something $1,000 house, I got 12 grand for putting the guy over. So we can always, we correct information when we say something incorrect. So I wanted to get those corrections in. And Ric Flair got 12 grand for Texas Stadium against Kerry and wasn't a happy camper about it. And I wouldn't have been either at that point, breaking a goddamn Buddy Rogers and Pat O'Connor record from 30 years before with people or whatever, and doing almost $500,000 to get 12 grand. Me and the Midnight got that on Starrcade 86 each a piece. We got 10. And one would have thought that the Texas Stadium with just that one location and not a lot of fucking rent and overhead, you'd give the guy that drew the fucking. But nevertheless, I digress.
And they made a ton on merch, and they certainly got their mileage out of that match. That Flair-Kerry match may have been on TV more than any other match in the 1980s.
The most famous match where a member of the family finally got to win the world championship, sets a gate record and a fucking Texas attendance record and the all kinds of records. And they couldn't even round it off to 15 just to make it sound a little more palatable.